Story 1. Not me, but a friend. The wedding was super awkward because they weren't sure the father of the bride would show up. Not because he didn't like the groom, but because he had to request permission from the judge in his case to attend after a nationwide warrant for his arrest for child pornography. Story 2. The bride wanted her cat at the wedding, so the groom and his best man brought the cat in the car and went through the car wash right before the ceremony. The cat became frightened, scratched the groom's face, and urinated on the best man's tuxedo just an hour before the wedding. Story 3. I worked at a wedding where the bride's entire family did not show up. They did not support the marriage, leaving empty tables everywhere. Story 4. The entire wedding was extremely dysfunctional and seemed like it had not been thought through at all. At one point during the ceremony, someone's phone rang loudly, which was shocking enough in itself. You should have seen everyone's face when he said hello and continued to have a conversation. Story 5. The groom got into a fistfight with one of the bartenders, and one of the guests became so intoxicated that emergency medical services were called. The police car that took the groom away was closely followed by the ambulance. I consider it one of the best weddings I've attended, at least in terms of being memorable, but the bridal couple, who have been married for over 20 years, may disagree. Story 6. I attended a dry wedding, which described not only the drink situation but the entire event as well. The ceremony took place in a tent during summer in the southern region. The dress code specified that men had to wear jackets, while women could not have overly exposed shoulders or low necklines. Linen attire was not permitted. The ceremony lasted just shy of 2 hours and included multiple speeches by the bride, groom, and the officiant. Both fathers sang gospel songs, and the best man played acoustic guitar for about 10 minutes. Guests had to reconfigure the tent for the reception while the wedding party took photographs. It was still summer. We discovered that there were assigned seats when the wedding planner went table to table, announcing where guests were to sit. The couple released guests to the buffet table by table. They stopped to chat with every table and took pictures. There was no dancing. The venue was by a lake, featuring a dock and a patio area near the water, but guests were required to stay in the tent. More speeches were given, and the bride and groom paused the buffet service to accommodate each speech. The sweet tea was weak. The bride's father delivered a lengthy speech, mentioning his daughter only twice, both times in reference to wishing for healthy baby boys for his son-in-law. The best man played guitar again. The wedding cake was placed in the sun. The buffet featured dry barbecue that the groom and his father-in-law smoked the day before, consisting solely of brisket. The sides were limited to macaroni and cheese and salad. I left between the table release and the cake cutting, partly because I was starving, partly because I had completely sweated through my suit, and partly because I had arrived 6 hours earlier. My +1, a family friend, and I went with my mom to a nearby restaurant. At least a dozen other guests were there, and I swear I saw a woman cry when a margarita was brought to her. We learned that the reception continued late into the evening, with the bride and groom asking the remaining guests to share their memories with them. They misspelled my name on the thank you card. Story 7. Meals were given based on whether you were on the bride's or groom's side, and there was a significant difference. The parents of the bride and groom had very different financial situations, and they each provided for their guests accordingly. We had hand stamps. Story 8. Worked a wedding as a caterer where the bride and groom were of mixed race. The families apparently did not get along, and the mothers developed a competitive mindset for the wedding. If one family received something, the other had to have it too or better. We were informed by the event planner that we could not serve one set of parents first. We had to serve them simultaneously to avoid any perception of favoritism. At one point, we had to move the bride's family table slightly due to an obstruction, but it was not that easy. We also had to move the groom's family table to ensure neither was closer to the sweetheart table. We arranged the parents at the same spot at their tables so they both had the same view of the sweetheart table, but they were not directly facing each other. I even ensured that the portion sizes were identical and that none of the plates looked better than the others. It was exhausting. Story 9. At the reception, I was sitting at a table with strangers. Turns out the bride's ex was with us. I know this because he told me so before he vomited onto the table, hitting my +1 in the face. We laugh about it now. Story 10. It was in the middle of nowhere, held at a country club that I don't think had ever hosted an event of any kind. There was one motel in the town, but there were no rooms left. So we planned to drive 3 to 4 hours there, see the wedding, and leave when they got to the part of the reception when the dancing and partying started. We arrived, went in, and there was hardly anyone there. We made our way to where they were going to have the ceremony in some courtyard, but the chairs were blowing away, and some staff were trying to chase them down. There had to have been a couple of hundred chairs, but there couldn't have been more than 20 or 30 of us. I kept wondering who rented all the rooms. We sat, almost amused in a horrified way. No one else showed up, and the start time came and went uncomfortably, without anyone but the few guests. Turns out there was no wedding. Someone cheated on someone the night before, and there was a big fight that morning. I never really learned the details. Eventually, someone from the venue came out and awkwardly said, "Sorry," and that we should go home because the entire event was being canceled. Story 11. It was at a Mormon church, and for some reason, Mormon churches have indoor basketball courts. Half of the court was used for a wedding reception, while the other half was occupied by a pickup basketball game being played by strangers who wouldn't leave. The ball hit the food table a couple of times. Story 12. I attended a wedding where the bride insisted on traveling by horse and carriage to the reception, which took a long time since the venue was a few miles from the church. Everyone was waiting for the bride and groom to arrive. When they finally showed up, the bride insisted that they go to their hotel room to consummate the marriage, as she was eager to get pregnant. This resulted in even more waiting until they appeared. The situation was quite uncomfortable. Story 13. My husband's stepsister's wedding was dull, and everyone experienced food poisoning. They had a receiving line, and my mother-in-law threw a massive tantrum and pouted because it made her uncomfortable. Story 14. The groom never showed up. He had been drinking and using drugs the night before and ended up in the hospital. They got married the following night in a stairwell. Story 15. We attended a wedding about 20 years ago in a charming little town. The hotel was lovely and also the site of the reception. The wedding took place early, around lunchtime, in a large French Catholic cathedral. It was about 95 degrees outside and the church was not air-conditioned. The ceremony included a full mass plus the actual wedding vows. By the time it ended, we were starving, hot, and thirsty. Cocktails were served at the hotel while photos were being taken, which took 3 hours. We didn't want to eat because we were expecting dinner. Everyone took their seats and the usual speeches were made. However, there was never any food. We ended up leaving and ordering pizza in our room. The following day, there was a gift opening with brunch. The brunch was for the bride and groom and their families, not for the guests. It was a very hungry weekend. Story 16. The bride had a loud meltdown in the church entryway that echoed around the congregation because her elderly grandmother had not adhered to her preferred color theme. She wanted everyone in black and white so her dress would stand out. Apparently, the tiny lady who loved her ruined everything with her duck egg blue hat. It was insane. Story 17. We were invited to the reception but not the ceremony. When we arrived, it seemed the reception had been underway for a couple of hours. The bride appeared surprised to see us. We took our gift from the table and left. Story 18. Attending an in-law's wedding. The morning ceremony serves breakfast, and it's not a pleasant one. Think of a conference breakfast at a hotel. There were rubbery eggs and cold pancakes. Each table received 1 bottle of sparkling wine for a single toast. On the morning of the wedding, I received a text message. It turns out the bride's questionable cousin was supposed to be her DJ. In surprising news, he bailed. She asked me to DJ her reception and play the music for her ceremony. I learned the ceremony music just 5 minutes before it started and managed it with my iPod and a speaker. I was then responsible for DJing the reception, including music for the couple's introduction, introducing speakers, starting the toasts, everything. I received exactly 1 thank you from that entire side of the family. I have since divorced my ex and distanced myself from his ungrateful family. Story 19. There were many speeches at the wedding. Both sets of parents, the maid of honor, and the best man spoke, along with every other member of the wedding party, totaling 6 members on each side. Some aunts and uncles also took turns speaking. Fortunately, most speeches occurred after dinner was served, so guests were not starving. However, the bar was closed during the speeches, and the table wine ran out quickly. The dinner and speeches lasted over 3.5 hours. By the time they concluded and dancing began, a large portion of the crowd had already left and missed the first dance and the cake cutting. To make matters worse, the bride and groom left immediately after dinner, probably waiting until after marriage to be intimate. There was no post-dinner dancing. Although they had a DJ, he was not needed as everyone just mingled and then left. Story 20. About 15 years ago, I attended a small wedding in Las Vegas as the maid of honor's date. Almost immediately after the ceremony, the newlyweds got into an argument about something I couldn't identify, and they ran off in separate directions. My then-girlfriend chased after the bride while everyone else pursued the groom. Within a minute, everyone had disappeared, and I had no service on my phone. I waited alone in the casino for about 2 hours until everyone returned and acted as if nothing unusual had occurred. That couple split after about 1.5 years. Story 21. I realized that I didn't actually want to marry him, and that it was the loneliest day of my life because he didn't even talk to me. He got so drunk that I had to knock on my sister's door to help me get out of my dress, which had hundreds of buttons down the back, while he was passed out sprawled on the bed. The guests had a great time. It was a beautiful wedding. We're divorced. Thank you for the rewards and the upvotes. It was a horrible moment which I am still paying for. Do not make my mistake. If it's a little no, that's a no. Forget the consequences. They can always be worse down the road. Story 22. Outside, right after the church wedding, the bride told the groom that he shouldn't have worn his glasses to the wedding. She also expressed her frustration with his father. Remarkably, they are still married after 30 years. Story 23. I attended a crazy wedding that my wife's friend hosted. She had worked with this girl about 6 months 5 years prior. They communicated, before the internet, by phone every few months and managed to get together once or twice a year, even though we lived about 10 miles apart. The bride was living with a rough, poorly educated man. He was a hard worker but fairly mean. She also had a 2-year-old son with him at the time of the wedding. We received an invitation about a week in advance for a Saturday afternoon ceremony at 4 o'clock at a restaurant. I had a lacrosse game, so I arrived around 4:15. Nothing had started except for the drinking. There were 25 guests in total, and the bride, groom, and best man were all drunk. The ceremony lasted just 5 minutes. The reception was more of the same, shots and minimal food. The little boy ran around in just a diaper after taking off all his clothes. The best man's speech seemed like an inspiration for Steve Buscemi's character in The Wedding Singer. It took place during the same era, the mid-1980s. The speech centered on how Greg had taken care of him, letting him live with the newly married couple. The best man's main hope for them was that they wouldn't argue anymore. It was the drunkest wedding I'd ever witnessed, and the night was far from over. They were flying out of Baltimore/Washington International Airport the next morning, and the bride suggested that everyone come to the hotel for more partying. We went. As we entered the lobby, another bride stood off to the side while her husband checked in. Suddenly, this intoxicated woman started berating the other bride, saying, "You're an ugly, rude bride. I'm the attractive one." The other girl wasn't passive, responding angrily and nearly escalating to a physical fight. "Let's go," both my wife and I said simultaneously. Story 24. Nice wedding. But there was an unexpected and amusing moment during the photo shoot in a beautiful nature reserve. The kangaroos weren't originally part of the photo plan, but the photographer embraced it when they wandered up, resulting in great photos. However, one of the kangaroos decided that lace looked delicious. For those unfamiliar, when a medium to large kangaroo wants something, it's very difficult to stop. And that, kids, is the story of how your dad lived up to his best man title by wrestling a kangaroo for Uncle Arthur and Auntie Kelly. Story 25. I was a bridesmaid at a close friend's wedding. Her mother-in-law was unusual. She insisted on being part of the wedding party. While we were helping the bride get dressed, she kept pinching her. For instance, while assisting her with stockings, she pinched her butt. The situation escalated when we were helping the bride with her lingerie, and the mother-in-law attempted to stick her finger in the bride's backside. I witnessed it. It was bizarre. The bride slapped her mother-in-law. The police were called, and things became chaotic. Story 26. I attended a wedding a few years ago that can only be described as unconventional. The groom was 24, while his bride was 42 and had 2 children over the age of 18, creating an unusual dynamic. The ceremony took place at a public park under a gazebo. The groom's parents were visibly unhappy with the wedding. It was extremely hot, and there was only enough food for about 30% of the guests. We were informed that the reception would be at the local elk lodge. Although it was not extravagant, it did have a bar and reception hall. However, those areas were not rented out, only the pool. As a result, the usual, very intoxicated clientele of a rural southern elk lodge was present, alongside 4 people, the bride, the groom, and 2 friends, in the pool passing around a bottle of whiskey. I left immediately, and they divorced 6 months later. Story 27. This was over 30 years ago. I grew up with the groom. The wedding itself was beautiful. However, the bride decided that one of the female guests was flirting with the groom and proceeded to take a swing at her while dressed in her poofy white gown. The marriage lasted 6 weeks. Story 28. Weddings where the best man uses his speech to see if he could have been a stand-up comedian are quite common. I have attended 3 like this, and it was so embarrassing. Story 29. The wedding in Florida was very beautiful. However, it was raining, and lightning and thunder began just as they started their vows. The sound shook the church. It was that loud. It stopped as soon as they finished their vows. It wasn't a bad wedding, just memorable due to the weather. Unfortunately, they did not stay married. Story 30. So, my wedding, I apologize in advance. I'm writing this on my phone and will jump from event to event. My now ex-wife wanted an extravagant wedding. I didn't, but I went along with it for her. Originally, her parents offered to either buy us a house or pay for this wedding, and she chose the wedding. She was a total bridezilla. She insulted both of our families at the rehearsal dinner, forced all grandparents to wear specific clothing she picked, and ordered her choice of food for everyone regardless of what they wanted. She even ordered a salad for my overweight relative. We had 250 guests, 23 of whom were mine to invite. Everyone else was from her list. Her father was an elected official, so half the guests were people her dad worked with that neither of us knew. She filled the registry with gifts that were too expensive, so most people gave cash instead, which I was okay with. Her gift to me was a boudoir photo shoot, which I found out she sent to her ex-boyfriend as well as me. Oh, he was at the wedding too, but I was unaware of their past relationship at the time. She cheated on me with him the day after the ceremony because an emergency caused us to reschedule our honeymoon, and she was upset with me. Long story short, don't get married just because you have a child together, and don't engage with someone unstable. It can backfire and leave you in a difficult situation. I've been happily divorced for 9 years now, but she still takes every opportunity to attempt to ruin my life. She still can't believe that I left her over her numerous and ongoing affairs during the 3 years we were married. Story 31. The wedding was wonderful, but one of the groomsmen, who was my friend, gave me some gummies during the reception, and I was high. A couple was there, people I knew from work, and the woman's daughter, who was about 12. I had learned from a different friend that this girl had tried to harm herself months earlier and had severe mental health issues. Anyway, I was high, and that little girl came over to me and asked if I would go outside with her. I said of course, thinking maybe she needed help with something. We went outside, and she led me a little way to a swing. I sat on a nearby brick wall as she swung. She started telling me all about her bullies at school, how she wanted to hurt them, how she thought she had demons inside her and would never be a good person, and how she was afraid her mom wanted her dead. I'm not very good at comforting people, but I tried. The girl's mother and her boyfriend walked past, and I figured they were just checking on their child. Later, I found out they just wanted to have intimacy outside behind the building and didn't care that their child was with me. Later, the girl found some snails and lizards in the garden and threw them into the fire. The mother made fun of her the entire time, talking about certain delusions or different personalities she had. I couldn't stand being around the parents anymore and had to leave the wedding. The little girl told me she thought I was an angel sent to her. I'm still friends with the couple who actually got married, but I stay away from the other couple. There's more about them that I know but won't say here. I feel really bad for that little girl, and I hope she gets some actual help. Story 32. It was the ex-wife's two best friends. They were an amazing couple, and the wedding ceremony was fine enough, though it wasn't particularly memorable. My ex-wife neglected to inform me that we would be camping the night before to prepare. I enjoy camping, but not when it involves walking through a muddy field to shower in a pay shower, then trying to keep my suit clean. The good news was that the entire wedding party was also camping in the muddy field, so I wasn't the only one who got dirty. My ex-wife's most recent ex was also part of the wedding party, so she abandoned me to spend time with him. There was no one I knew at the reception except for the couple and my ex-wife. It was a dry wedding, which wasn't too bad, aside from the lack of social lubricant among so many strangers. The stepfather of the bride was supposed to lead us to the reception, back in the pre-smartphone era. All was well until he got on the highway and accelerated to over 100 miles per hour. After hitting 80 miles per hour, I refused to continue to speed. Eventually, I pulled over until we encountered another wedding guest who also didn't want to drive nearly double the posted speed limit. This became my problem for choosing not to follow the reckless driver. As far as I know, they are still together. I hope so. They were cool, but I am content to never see any of those people ever again in my life. Story 33. A unity candle started a fire in the church. They were able to extinguish it before it escalated, but it was definitely an interesting incident. Story 34. Went to a wedding of a couple that we had no idea were extremely religious. There was no alcohol and no dancing. A string quartet played during the brief social hour while pictures were taken, but they left as dinner was being served, and there was no more music afterward. A magician performed a short stage act as the cake was being served. There were no traditional customs like tossing the bouquet or anything that could be considered sinful. There were many prayers. The only positive aspect of the evening was that we were seated with extended cousins of the bride's family, who spent the entire time criticizing the bride's parents and sharing stories about the extreme fundamentalist Christian practices they had imposed on their children. The bride left her husband shortly after they were married. The last we heard from her, she was living with two men who were both at least 10 years older than she was and seemed quite proud of splitting her time between their two homes. Story 35. My maternal uncle and his wife had a chaotic wedding from the start. The dresses. The bride's mother made the bridal party dresses, which unfortunately looked poorly constructed. The bridal party was charged $300 to $400 for each dress, similar to what you would pay at a major bridal retailer. However, those dresses are professionally made and have a cohesive look. I was supposed to be a junior bridesmaid and had my own dress made by her, but she forgot it. As a result, I was out of place in nice clothes while the bride's mother complained the whole time. My mother's dress was too small because the mother of the bride told her to lose weight before the wedding, and when she didn't, it was deemed her fault. My mother was pregnant, so losing weight wasn't an option. The maid of honor's dress was actually a wedding gown. The mother of the bride and maid of honor insisted on it, and the bride backed down after being threatened with the cancellation of the wedding funded by her parents. The groomsmen were visibly hungover, with some appearing to be under the influence of drugs. The maid of honor fainted repeatedly during the ceremony, causing disruptions. She refused medical attention each time and seemed to feel better when all eyes were on her. Finally, just before the bride and groom exchanged vows, the bride hissed at the groom that if he ever divorced her, she would take everything he had. She repeated this threat after the birth of each child, stating she would take the children away from him. Story 36. A recent event wasn't a horror story, but it was unfortunate because I felt for the groom and bride. Many things did not go their way. They were stressed, and even afterward, they referred to it as a disaster. As someone who is married, I didn't want them to look back and only think about that. It rained, and they wanted the ceremony to be outdoors. We were prepared for light to medium rain, but not heavy rain. The best man did not have his rental delivered, and it was not his fault. It was just a miscommunication. Many factors were out of the couple's control, and unfortunately, without a dedicated day of wedding planner, the ultimate decision-making always fell on them. Many people were helpful, but no one was in a position to decide, lead, or organize. Even the execution of their plans relied heavily on the groom and bride doing things themselves. This was not due to a lack of willingness to help, but because they were the only ones who fully understood what needed to be done and how. When things did not go as planned, they had to make decisions quickly and relay that information to many guests. Regarding the rain, they purchased around 100 clear umbrellas because they wanted all the guests to be uniform and look nice in the rain for pictures. Unfortunately, the umbrellas were poorly made and broke easily after being unpacked. Guests were told they could not use their sturdy umbrellas from home and had to use the fragile ones instead. I saw many guests open the umbrellas only for them to break immediately. Once we held the ceremony in light to medium rain, about 50% of guests were holding their umbrellas with two hands because they broke, 40% were not using any umbrella at all, and 10% simply used their own umbrellas. No one was truly being disrespectful to the couple. It was just setback after setback, and their entire schedule was falling apart. Despite this, they still got married and had smiles all around. However, by the end of the night, they referred to the day as a disaster. My advice: hire a day of wedding planner, or at least designate someone else to manage everything so that the only focus is on getting married. Story 37. Summer in California. The wedding was at a charming little church, which was double booked. As a result, the wedding I attended put up an arch in the parking lot and held the ceremony there. Both sets of grandmothers fainted from the heat, with the bride's grandmother going down first and actually hitting the pavement. Someone caught the groom's grandmother. The bride's 98-year-old grandmother went to the hospital but ended up being okay. We then went off to the reception at a different location. All of the groom's friends and the bride's family behaved inappropriately, making crude jokes and hooting like monkeys. They shouted explicit comments. The bride and groom left early for their hotel room, while the groom's friends and the bride's cousins gathered outside their window to laugh, yell, and eavesdrop on the wedding night to give the groom feedback on his performance. I was 8 years old and still vividly remember how incredibly uncomfortable that wedding was. My mother refused to let us spend time with that side of the family again. Story 38. I was invited to a coworker's wedding at a nice country club. Both of them were from New York, and the bride was a strong, confident, no-nonsense kind of woman. The priest who was supposed to officiate the wedding fell ill, so the church sent in a backup priest. He began the ceremony and proceeded to deliver a speech about how, according to the Bible, the wife is supposed to be subservient to the man, making his meals and keeping the house clean. It was straight out of the 1950s. We all knew the bride well and watched in amazement as she managed to keep her composure, but we could tell she was absolutely fuming. After the ceremony ended, and she ran off to cry, her whole family, including her father and brothers, cornered the priest. I genuinely thought they were going to confront him aggressively. Story 39. Our friend, who struggled with addiction, was facing the departure of his amazing wife because he couldn't control himself. At the wedding, he shockingly informed everyone that she wouldn't sleep with him anymore. He was quite graphic due to his inebriation and started confrontations with anyone who told him to be quiet. The bridal party and groomsmen had to escort him out as he engaged in a fight with the groomsmen outside. Story 40. She bragged for years about how her father was the general manager of a prestigious hotel. Then they announced that the wedding would take place there. The wedding was held in the hotel's banquet hall, which had partitions to separate business meetings. There was a small arch adorned with artificial flowers at the front of the room. That was the only decoration. The officiant had never met the bride or the groom. She arrived 15 minutes late and read from a sheet with responses to questions they had answered on an online form. The ceremony lasted about 15 minutes. The reception was standard. and the best man and maid of honor improvised their speeches, which was evident. The bar turned out to be a cash bar, although we were told it would be an open bar, so nobody brought any cash. Her father had promised to reserve another room for the after-party. When we arrived, it was a similar room with no decorations, containing only 3 bags of Doritos and some pretzels. We sat in chairs and talked for about half an hour. Most guests canceled their hotel reservations because nobody was drinking, so they were fine to simply drive home. Story 41. The bride forgot to bring the groom's suit, so he ended up wearing the pastor's jacket and tie for the ceremony. The pastor, an evangelical Christian, made some very anti-woke and sexist remarks off script, while part of the ceremony included a few unconventional practices. The grandmother went off on a tangent in her speech about ancient aliens. When she returned to her main points, she questioned how a man could love a woman as she ages, mentioning sagging breasts, a flat bottom, wrinkles, and thinning hair, emphasizing the sacrifices a man makes when marrying a woman. The sister ranted about COVID-19 being a scam. There was a highly sexist skit where the bride's brothers demanded payment for her, arguing about who would clean their house, cook their food, and mend their clothes, leading to the groom needing to buy her with beer. The mother was upset that her goats couldn't be the ring bearers at the venue. Notably, this wedding took place in Los Angeles about a month ago. Story 42. When my uncle got married, his bride-to-be wore a wedding dress 2 sizes too small that was supposed to be strapless and wore a black strapped bra with it. She also decided the night before the wedding that she wanted to be a blonde and bleached her black hair. Needless to say, she looked quite unusual and painted her eyes black. I don't think I have ever seen a bride look quite so much like a train wreck. Then my uncle left the reception to sit at the bar and watch the baseball game. The cake was 2 store-bought cakes that the bride stacked on top of each other. The food was good because I catered it, but the rest was interesting, to say the least. Story 43. I attended my wife's cousin's wedding. We flew across the country to go, as we rarely see my wife's family and they were all attending. The bride had a nervous breakdown and canceled the wedding 3 days prior to the event, after we had already arrived. She eventually decided to go through with it again a day after the original date. The groom's family is well off and had paid for the original wedding, then managed to secure a small winery to host the new wedding at the last minute. About 90% of the guests still attended the second wedding, many changing their plans and even flights. During the ceremony, the bride appeared intoxicated and took the microphone to launch a tirade, openly criticizing the wedding venue, which had organized a lovely reception in just 36 hours. The venue owners and their family were present, serving drinks and snacks. Additionally, she made fun of my nephews, my wife's sister-in-law, who was dealing with postpartum depression and had gained weight, and other relatives. She spent the remainder of the evening sneaking away to smoke marijuana with her bridesmaids. Story 44. It was a cold spring morning when I attended a friend of my wife's wedding, where I didn't know anyone. They handed out little boxes, each containing a butterfly, and asked everyone to release the butterflies at the end. However, it was quite cold, and when people opened the boxes, most of the butterflies fell to the ground. As guests left, a trail of butterflies was left behind. My wife and I thought, they aren't going to walk there, are they? But they did, crushing the butterflies as they walked. The procession was filing out as the typical wedding music played, and we cringed as people harmed the poor creatures. What a terrible idea it was. Story 45. Maybe not the worst, but certainly the most poorly planned. Friends of mine hired a limousine to take them and their bridal party from the church to the reception. They stayed back with the photographer to take more pictures while everyone else went to the reception. The mother of the bride was at the reception, received a phone call, and burst out laughing while looking for her keys. Now, this bridal party was not of the slim variety, and apparently no one took that into consideration. As the mother ran past me, I asked what happened, and she said, 3 of them can't fit in the limousine. I have to go pick them up. Story 46. It was a wedding where the bride and groom lived far away from their families, and everyone, including me, had to fly in. The mother-in-law wasn't too happy with her son marrying the bride. The wedding went well, and the reception was proceeding smoothly, but the mother-in-law had a scowling expression and was audibly complaining. During the speeches, the bride and groom paused to thank those who helped with the setup and decorations. The mother-in-law was upset that she wasn't acknowledged for some reason. She ended up causing a major scene and physically attacked her son while screaming at the bride and groom. Her entire side of the family left the wedding reception, which accounted for half of the attendees. Overall, the guests who remained made the most of it, but the bride and groom were visibly shaken and left shortly after. They ended up getting a divorce a few years later. Story 47. The bride and groom spent the night celebrating. She broke her finger while exiting the church when her dogs pulled on the leash. She also requested the bridesmaids to perform a dance and gave her husband an awkward lap dance. It was an unusual night. Story 48. My own wedding, from the planning up until the marriage, crumbled. First things first, my ex was a huge mama's boy. Her son could do no wrong, ever. Second, he was an alcoholic. I knew he was an alcoholic before I agreed to marry him, but thought I could change him. His mother had to plan the whole wedding, from the unfortunate plastic bouquets to the ham on the buffet table in a dark, smoke-filled veterans hall. It was decorated with pink and white balloons and streamers, with no real effort on her part. The wedding was in his hometown, and my family traveled to attend. My mother begged me not to marry the alcoholic narcissist the night before the wedding, which was related to his drunken and obnoxious behaviors at the wedding rehearsal dinner. But I loved him, and we married the next day. Of course, his whole family was intoxicated and made spectacles of themselves. The best man drove his car into a ditch, sending the wedding cake flying into the dashboard and vents. Naturally, it was everyone's fault but the drunken man in the back seat. Needless to say, this didn't last. I always thought I needed a do-over, but I chose to take the justice of the peace route for the next wedding. I let my daughter plan her own wedding with minimal interference from me. The mother-in-law, on the other hand, it's always the mother-in-law. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.